By the end of the century, over 80% of the human population will likely be living in cities. But the well-being and the security of those living in cities is increasingly threatened by climate change, by flooding and by heat waves. Now, nature-based solutions hold significant promise to address those challenges, but only if they are implemented properly. In this film, we will be exploring the many ways that people are working with nature in urban areas, focusing on Newcastle and London, two contrasting cities that are really suffering from the impacts of climate change. And we will be exploring the critical role that the research community must play in ensuring that those designing and implementing nature-based solutions are equipped with the very best information.
So Newcastle is a very vibrant city, but it's got a very industrial past with the Industrial Revolution, coal mining, shipbuilding, train building, a history of heavy industry. So as Newcastle as a city grows, as population expands and the demand for housing and schools and more highways grow, these cause problems because the rainfall falls on these houses, falls on the roadways, and it's less permeable than it has been in the past. So you can get greater runoff coming from those sites, and that water has to go somewhere.
There have been a few days and weeks over the last 10 years in particular that have posed a real challenge for the city. And a famous one we call Thunder Thursday, where there was an enormous rainstorm over the city and it just completely flooded all the streets. You had cascades of water coming down the alleyways towards the river, just showing that the city really can't cope with the level of water that we're expecting from storms, from these flood events in the future. So there was a project developed in the northern part of the city where initially the idea had been to put in a large new pumping station into an area that had flooded regularly over the last decade or so. But they realized that they would have to build such a large pumping station and such a large kind of concrete infrastructure that they actually physically didn't have space to put that into the city. So instead they started to look at nature-based solutions. And while there was some uncertainty to start with about whether it would really be able to cope with the flooding risk over time, what we've seen is as that nature-based solution has been put in, so this is a series of different ponds, it's recanalizing the river to make it a more natural riverbank, it has been able to withstand the floods that we've had recently. So that's the kind of example where as soon as you start to actually put the numbers in for what it will mean to build our way out of climate change using concrete, it becomes almost an impossible task. And so while nature-based solutions might feel a bit more uncertain and people might be a bit hesitant about it, they can also see that the road ahead for grey infrastructure really doesn't stretch that far. We're not going to be able to build our way out of climate change using concrete.
What's really important now through policy that we're looking at is if any development that's going to go ahead, we need to make sure we have a baseline of what the nature is on that area already. And as the developers come in and put these buildings and houses up, they actually have to leave that site in a better biodiverse way than it was beforehand. So it's all about biodiversity net gain. Even though we're developing and moving on, we need to bring additional benefit to biodiversity, and that's going to be of benefit to all of us. The likes of the Naturevation project, for example, have studied all of that, and the tools that they have on their website are invaluable to show people how these nature-based solutions can work in real life.
So one of the things we're trying to do is just make nature-based solutions, if you like, more legible. That's the kind of word that I like to use. City planners can see that they've worked in previous examples. And what's key there is to have the data that really tells us how nature-based solutions are performing. So we can really see how over time different kinds of benefits will be generated and different costs offset.
Tools are really important in influencing and sharing that knowledge with people, because once they know that it's worked somewhere else, they're much more likely to take that type of intervention forward.
Adding to this pool of evidence-based knowledge is Newcastle's Urban Green Infrastructure Facility.
So grey infrastructure has been around for centuries. It's based on fundamental physics, and we know what to expect from that. Nature-based solutions are a little bit more of an unknown. And so there's always been a hesitancy in industry and practice to adopt those measures. What we're hoping to do here at the National Green Infrastructure Facility is to provide an evidence base on which to provide certainty and reassurance so that people can design them with confidence, and hopefully the uptake will be greater. Largely at the facility, we conduct most of our experiments externally, although here in the lab we have look at the finer nuances of materials. So we're looking particularly at the soil-water interaction, and externally, whenever we're working outside, we look at atmosphere, plant, soil interactions. The beauty of having a facility where we have experiments outside is that we're exposed to natural weather conditions. So in the lab we can recreate things as much as we like, but there's nothing quite like being out there in the real environment and putting things through their paces. So with heat and island effects in our cities raising the temperatures, the albedo effect of all our shiny surfaces, pavements and glass buildings and the like, we're currently shifting away from using our fossil fuels to heat and cool our buildings and looking for more renewable solutions. One possibility is to use ground source heat energy, and green spaces provide an ideal opportunity to make use of that space. Shallow, near surface ground source heat in wet environments is ideal for heat transfer. So what we're able to do is use green infrastructure that's already managing our excess surface water to actually provide a heat energy and a heat sink. And they're not just an amenity, something nice to look at, but they're actually actively providing cooling to the environment above and also restoring water storage capacity to the soil below, meaning we can mitigate greater floods depending on the species and how we manage those species. Another experiment we're conducting here is using biochar to mitigate road runoff pollutants, whether they be diesels, runoff, salts from de-icing, and microplastics. A lot of those organics we're able to capture using different materials like biochar. It's essentially a charcoal that we can mix in within our topsoil, and that sits there and holds the moisture, holds that polluted water, holds that long enough for the microbiome to do its magic, essentially creating a less contaminant-rich water, which then feeds into our groundwater. So we can engineer the different soil types to have the right permeability, the right infiltration characteristics. And it means we can then use evapotranspiration, i.e. the sort of pumping aspect of the plant, to be able to take that water and put it back into the atmosphere in a slow and controlled time, rather than overwhelming those drains. The benefit is that if something goes wrong with concrete, it's got to sit there and wait for us to come along and solve it, to mend it, repair it, whereas something nature-based, to some extent they can manage themselves to a better extent than grey infrastructure can.
The swale is the largest feature within the National Green Infrastructure Facility. We have it rigged up with sensors every 4 or 5 metres, collecting data every 10 seconds. And as we release the water, these sensors pick up the information. Within the swale, we also have leaky barriers. These are made of larch wood, so planks squashed together, very different to grey infrastructure. But we can run the swale and then we can tweak that design of the leaky barrier. Then we can recycle the water back round to the top of the swale. And then when we release the water again, we're basically capturing the very small changes in the design. This is important because it's very difficult to capture what's happening in the real world. So the swale gives us that opportunity. We're not quite in the laboratory inside. We're outside, fairly controlled, but we're still capturing really vital information that represents what happens in nature.
So when there's another big storm comes along, there's still some more capacity.
The science and the data that we're collecting through these types of monitoring campaigns, they're helping us to understand and quantify the impacts of nature-based solutions. So when using grey infrastructure, it typically gives just one benefit or one solution. So that might be, for example, reducing flood risk, but it generally pushes a problem downstream and generates other problems around it. However, if we move into a more nature-based solutions, we are not destroying the woodland around it. It is using natural materials sourced locally, and also it's offering multiple benefits. So, for example, it's encouraging wildlife and improving water quality.
We need that sort of approach to nature-based solutions to stretch beyond the tree, if you like, to be able to recognise that there are other nature-based solutions that are needed in cities. For example, in Europe, we can see cities where they're now mandated to take up paving. So you're having a whole set of neighbourhoods removing their paving and planting front yard gardens instead. And that kind of policy would really make a difference in a city like Newcastle.
The terrace streets in Arthur's Hill, they're Victorian terraces. I mean, they were built with coal fires. Terrace flats are quite high density buildings, you know, and they're part of that kind of dependence on coal and fossil fuels, and quite a hard kind of landscape that came with that. And there's not much sort of spaces for gardens. They're concrete yards generally. The roots of Greening Wingrove are in nature. The roots of Greening Wingrove are in Thunder Thursday and the flash floods of 2012 that affected Newcastle city centre, and a feeling that we needed to take more ownership of our local environment as residents. Partly that was a result of the terrible fly tipping and litter problems which were plaguing our streets. So that's a very depressing thing to have to live with. But Greening Wingrove has tried to encourage a kind of transition away from that a little bit, and a reconnection with nature in a way that wasn't a priority when those houses were built. You can see this bike garden space developed from lots of volunteers who've just clubbed in and done the things they wanted to do, express themselves. So there are a few different connections with growing. One of them, particularly through the time exchange, has been the use of the bike garden by volunteers. I think it's been beneficial for them to have a space that they can come to that's not within the terraced flats and terraced houses, and a regular meeting with other people. And there's great research being done about the effects of our physical environment on the ability of people to cope with dementia and ageing. And that's just one small window into the massive role that the environment plays. You can see the community orchard, which has grown out of lots of activities, events over and over again, people planting things and caring for things. And then the Wild West End project, going on bat walks, seeing skylarks, swifts and things. The sheer scale of community activity that's come about just from that nurturing approach is really impressive. You can see that also having influenced the terraces. You can see people having greened their front yards and grown vegetables in their front yards. So
yeah, I think one of the really impressive things about how communities in Newcastle are working with nature-based solutions is that they really do see them in that holistic way. So they really have seen them as a way of addressing questions of the livability of their neighbourhoods, but also recognising the really valuable health and well-being benefits that nature-based solutions bring to communities.
A lot of people in this area don't actually have very much money.
You like tomatoes?
So we can't afford to get out of the city. A lot of people don't have cars.
Tomatoes are really cool plant.
And so with this, people don't have to get out of the city. It's on our doorstep.
What you wait for these yellow flowers?
And that's really good for people's vitality and health.
At the moment, there are really good examples of communities and individual actors trying to work with nature in the city, but it lacks a kind of joined up approach that would really make a difference to the kind of flooding that the city is experiencing. And to do that, you really need more of a steer from central government, and you need some of the key actors in the city, beyond the city council, beyond the university and beyond the environment agencies. So we're talking about some of the economic actors and the housing developers to really get behind this as well.
Medical practitioners are also beginning to see the value of nature for health, and prescriptions involving nature are increasingly featuring in treatments, especially for mental health issues.
We are a GP practice. A large number of our patients are in low-income families. They suffer higher levels of unemployment and ill health. So the allotment project was really developed to try and address some of them factors by having access to green space. We do use a service called social prescribing to try and market the allotment project to our patients. We can see improvements. We have a number of patients that were taking large numbers of medications, and we have seen patients actually reduce the amount of medication that they are on and have an improvement into their mental health.
It was suggested by Dr. Ralph that I came and got involved because I lost my mum and then I lost my dad in quite short succession. And rather than take tablets, he suggested getting involved with the community allotment. It's just like an oasis. The ability to repurpose wasteland and turn it into something beautiful is not only good for the environment and the bees, but it's good for people. It's given a positive focus for that grief, which I didn't have, and the solution of taking tablets was probably not the right one, because it only pushes grief down the road rather than actually grieving. And fitness-wise, I just like being in the fresh air, but it's better than tablets, getting outside. We've set up a little self-support group here. I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for the allotment. I went through a real bad time, so thank you.
City life and our separation from nature brings a great deal of stress, but Oxfords Farm has some of the answers.
So Oxfords Farm is a community farm. It's been here since the late 70s, when it was started by local residents who wanted space to raise animals and grow their own fruit and vegetables. So you can see by looking around the farm that we're surrounded by the 3 bridges transporting people to and from the city. We've got the post-industrial landscape down here. So actually, Oxfords Farm was on the site of a former lead works. One of the things that we had to do with this land is remediate it and remove all the heavy metals from the soil, so arsenic, mercury, lead and cadmium, for example. And we've done that, and now this land has been reborn, and it's now something really, really productive that everybody can enjoy. At the moment we're on the brink of a climate crisis, and farming plays an important role. Obviously we've got nearly 8 billion people on this world to feed, but we need to do that in a sustainable way. So what we're interested in here is getting people to understand the implications of farming, how farming can be improved, and some of the sustainability issues around food, so particularly food miles, use of products and pesticides and fertilisers, and how farming can interact best with its local environment, so to cause minimum amount of harm. We're not saying that people should give up eating all meat, but it's important to understand what goes into producing meat and also what goes into producing other types of food. We want people to be able to make choices based on a good amount of information, and also understand that there's different ways of doing things that are less intensive. So for example, the garden you can see behind me, full of fruit and veg, we use it to supply local restaurants, and we use it in our cafe, and we sell it in our shop. And that's a way of demonstrating that food doesn't have to come from miles and miles away. You can actually produce an awful lot in a small space like we have behind me here. But it's also about having a haven of nature and green space here in the middle of a very urban area. Farming can be sustainable.
But it's not only cities like Newcastle that can create natural oases at their industrial hearts. In London too, people are innovating to ensure that nature can thrive, even amidst the concrete.
Yeah, most major cities have been built on water, essentially. And a lot of the water spaces within Britain are post-industrial spaces. The downside of that, in a sense, right now, is now the ships have gone, we've got a lot of concrete walls around here. Floating gardens like this one is a really, really lovely opportunity for people to come down, sit here, listen to the water lapping, and begin to feel part of nature. It's something that if you're living in a city, especially with the new developments coming up, you sometimes lose that connection. And we now know that for mental health and well-being, that connection with nature, being around it, is really important. So the floating ecosystem that Biomatrix have here is really perfect, because not only do you get the beautiful plant life that we've got here and the greenery, actually underneath there's a root system that comes straight through the platform, and it allows the fish to have nurseries down there to grow and to live and to shelter. So within London, there are a lot of canals, a lot of rivers, a lot of reservoirs, and there's a really lovely opportunity to join all of these together and create a new nature reserve that can go north, south, east, west, right around the city.
There is evidence that bringing nature into our cities brings multiple benefits. Though much more research is needed into the effectiveness of nature-based solutions, it is clear that the cities of the future could be beautiful places, places that calm us and inspire us, places where we thrive as part of and not separate from the natural world.